At the beginning of the 7th century, the ancient world was divided between two enemies that probably thought of each other as immortal. The Romans and the Persians, in different forms, had been fighting each other for over half a millennium. They knew the battleground, they knew the weapons, and they poured everything they could into fighting those fights. But while they were focused on each other, a new religion and a new approach to conquest was being born in a desert to the south. By the turn of the 8th century, Islam had obliterated the old order, wiping out the Persian Empire entirely and reducing mighty Rome to a few scattered possessions outside the walls of Constantinople. Hey there, I get irritated by people who are constantly trying to cram the modern world into some convoluted ancient civilization analogy. But that episode is always with me. As I look at U.S. security strategy and mock the way my government is constantly trying to scare people enough to justify our defense budgets, I often wonder, what are we missing? What's that thing that's going to come screaming out of the wilderness to annihilate the world as we know it while we're focused on the wrong threats entirely? Well, I'm beginning to suspect it's frickin' Bitcoin. The US government has been working really hard trying to make rivalry with China a thing. We spent decades building them up into a manufacturing powerhouse. While the rest of us were distracted by the orange plague we had elected president, the Pentagon did its big, great power competition launch, and it's honestly pretty underwhelming. The US media is doing its usual job of photocopying Pentagon press releases, but there's only so much they can do with reality. We are spending trillions upon trillions of dollars to keep China from exerting any influence in the South China Sea, despite the fact that China has the exact same interest in open sea lanes that we do. We are also spending $1 trillion to expand our nuclear arsenal, despite the fact that, depending on how you measure it, we have somewhere between 20 and 100 times more nuclear weapons than China does. None of this makes any sense. The only way to make it look like China threatens the United States is if you define U.S. interests as starting about 10 miles off of China's coastline, which the usual cast of lobbyists are right now working very hard to do. You know what is threatening to the United States? Money. Money is weird. Nobody really understands it, and even the folks who used to pretend to understand it, the economists, pretty much gave up after the 2008 financial crisis. According to the economists of, say, 2004, the current level of U.S. national debt and the level of Federal Reserve chicanery should have led to hyperinflation, years ago. But it hasn't. According to the way economists saw things back in the 20th century, with our current debt levels, the U.S. position as the reserve currency and maybe a functioning society should have ended catastrophically in 2009 and in 2013. In 2017, and certainly in 2020. But the crash keeps not happening. Why is that? Well, my theory, which nobody has talked me out of yet, is that there just isn't an alternative. Back in the first half of the 20th century, the United Kingdom was financially dominant. It sacrificed its balance sheet to fight 2 wars with Germany, giving the US dollar the opening it needed to become the currency that mattered. If you look, you can find figures that will tell you that the US balance sheet is in worse shape today than Britain's was back in the 1920s, or possibly even in the 1940s. But back in the 1920s, Britain had to deal with real competition. Back then, US finances were in great shape, and our bankers, if not our public, were eager to jump in and take over. The United States of today doesn't have to worry about any plausible competition. There is no alternative. Back before 2008, economists thought that international investors could abandon the dollar and US debt if the US didn't rein in spending. Both the euro and the Chinese renminbi looked like plausible competitors. Today, they really don't. An underappreciated aspect of the 2008 financial crisis is that Europe and China's financial pictures now look even worse than that of the United States. Add in demographic pressures, and there is no way any sane investor would consider dropping the dollar for any Eurasian country's national currency. Which is why I find continued US indulgence of cryptocurrency mind-boggling. US dollar supremacy and the ability to print as much money as we want whenever we want depends on there not being any alternative. And we're all just sitting here applauding as Silicon Valley develops a wide range of competition. To be clear, I think the chances of Bitcoin itself being that alternative are pretty damn slim. Extreme price volatility combined with slow and costly transactions do not a dollar competitor make. But this sector is just a decade old, and a growing number of the world's smartest and richest people are now working to come up with new coins and new technologies that could provide a real dollar alternative. I first learned about Bitcoin on a website called Hacker News back in 2010 or so. I considered buying back then, but didn't for a simple reason. Quick interjection. At this point, you may be getting the idea that this whole video is just an extended cry of regret over my not buying Bitcoin 10 years ago. And you'd be exactly right about that. But I think my reasoning from back then is still valid. Back then, and still today, if you scratch the surface even a little, all the arguments for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are fundamentally revolutionary. Crypto is going to change everything. Crypto is the new safe store of value. Crypto is going to replace the dollar. Crypto is going to replace the whole financial system. This has never made sense to me. Crypto does not have an army. The US government does. And for any of those extravagant crypto promises to come true, magic internet money doesn't just have to defeat the US government, but every other government in the world that wants to have any kind of control over its own borders, budget, taxes, or anything else. Cryptocurrency's fundamental promise isn't about helping North Korean dissidents transfer money. It's about making it so that nobody anywhere on this planet is allowed to have any kind of government at all. China's government recognizes this, which is why it's been taking progressively more and more draconian measures against cryptocurrency. The Chinese government is terrified of Bitcoin. The US government should be afraid as well. Cryptocurrency's fundamental promise is anarchy. I didn't want to bet on that in 2009, and I don't want to bet on that in 2021. And up until this last run-up in price, I was pretty sure that a bet on Bitcoin was a losing one, at least in the long term. I'm not so sure about that anymore. I am a confirmed Elon Musk fanboy. I think he's largely changing the world for the better, and I think we'd be a lot better off if we had 10 more of him. All that said, I think what he's doing, pumping up cryptocurrency, is incredibly irresponsible. It's also incredibly ungrateful. I don't begrudge him the government subsidies he's gotten. The way he has used the US government is part of his genius, in my opinion. But the fact remains that both the Tesla and SpaceX empires are completely reliant on US government spending and are therefore reliant on the US dollar. His patronage of the cryptocurrency industry, one that more or less openly promises to burn the dollar down, is just eye-bleedingly irresponsible. And it's not just Elon Musk. Back in 2017, during the last run-up in cryptocurrency prices, it was still easy to discount it as some crazy fad. But when the prices crashed, it was clear that a lot of US consumers were hurt, and hurt badly. I thought that back then that now the US government was finally going to step in and shut this thing down. Well, it seems like the opposite has happened, and cryptocurrencies have just gotten more respectable. Cryptocurrency entrepreneurs are getting more and more fawning write-ups in the business press. I now get most of my information on the topic from Bloomberg, which treats crypto as just another fun asset class. And more crypto funds and businesses are being bought up by major financial institutions or having successful IPOs. There is now a large and growing derivatives market based on crypto. You know, derivatives, the sort of thing that blew up the world economy in 2008, except instead of being based on real estate, these new derivatives are based on assets that regularly drop and spike in price by 50% over the course of a week. So if you talk to a small-time crypto investor, they'll give you the revolution pitch. But in my experience, if you talk to slightly more big-time folks, at least privately, they'll tell you that that's all kind of a joke. The revolution is over and the usual suspects have already come piling in. They'll tell you that the largest crypto investors, whether openly or surreptitiously, are probably folks like Goldman Sachs and a bunch of Greenwich, Connecticut hedge funds. In fact, with all the talk about liberating Venezuelans and North Koreans, Bitcoin is already practically a wing of US foreign policy. Don't worry, Rob, they say, everything's fine. To which I say, no, it is not fucking fine. The key problem is the amount of money that is mixed up in this stuff and the way that the amounts of money get exponentially larger with each peak. The 2021 peak is at least the third time a big up and crash has happened in Bitcoin prices. All the other cryptocurrencies tend to move in tandem. I assume it's impossible to measure accurately, but it seems that the volume of money invested in crypto is at least 5 times larger this time around than it was in 2017. What if that keeps happening? One figure I read estimated the total crypto market at $2.5 trillion. What if it's $10 trillion the next time? And what happens when all of that money goes up in smoke? We're beginning to talk about systemic risk here. It's some pretty scary stuff. To be clear, I still assume that that's not going to happen, but I didn't think the crypto market would come back after 2017 either, and I was definitely wrong about that. The arguments that this time, for sure, Bitcoin is done with hypergrowth could be right, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other cryptocurrencies that could be offering 10x returns. The assumption that the crypto and normal markets are going to happily coexist assumes that investors in everything else are going to be content with their normal investments while watching their friends and neighbors make 1,000% returns. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What's more, with every dollar an established player that jumps in, momentum builds. The 2025 peak could make the 2021 peak look as insignificant as the 2017 peak looks today. Advocates of cryptocurrency like to claim that by attacking the US dollar, they're attacking US empire, which bombs weddings all over the world. If you've seen any other videos on this channel, you can tell that I'm pretty sympathetic to that argument. But when you attack the US government dollar, you're also attacking the US government dollar that pays for my parents' health care. You're also attacking the global positioning system that helps us all travel around on our smartphones. How about climate change? You care about climate change? Well, guess where most of the data we use to learn about climate change comes from? The US government. There are countless things that the US government does and that governments around the world do that we would miss very much. Cryptocurrency poses a vastly greater threat to the American way of life and the world's way of life than China could ever pose. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and come back next time when we will talk about how crypto is Ronald Reagan's revenge.